Hi, my name is Teresa Russell, leader of Early Foundations for Jackson-Madison County Schools. During this presentation, we will take a closer look at the ending section of the instructional framework. We will discuss what makes an effective ending, why it is so important to assess student mastery, and we'll take a look at some examples from various grade levels. Let's get started. During this presentation, we will focus on the ending portion of the instructional framework. We know from the research of Hattie and others that the beginning and end of a lesson are vitally important. Think of the beginning and end as the bookmarks that hold your lesson together. Let's take a look at a graphic illustration of the instructional framework. We begin with the how portion, which consists of the starter, the lesson engagement, and the ending. The what portion of the lesson contains core actions 1, 2, and 3 of the IPG. Together the how and the what make a solid lesson presentation. Every day in every lesson, we are looking for a consistent beginning, engaged students with checks for understanding and feedback, and a solid ending. Here we see the instructional framework as it is laid out, with the starter, engagement, and ending across the top, and the standards alignment and core actions providing the foundation for the lesson. Together, these form our instructional framework, which serves as the guidance for how we teach and what we teach. A closer look at the ending is shown here. Notice some of the elements of the ending are similar to those in the starter. Take a minute to compare the two. The ending is made up of a closing assessment and a timekeeping strategy. The ending helps you answer the question, have my students mastered the essential concepts from today's lesson? Keep in mind that the ending is not simply a teacher summary, because that does not ask the students to demonstrate their learning. This activity or closing assessment is focused on what students have learned and not what just the teacher has taught. Because the ending is often hurried or even overlooked, it is important to have a timekeeping strategy. You will want to allot 7 to 12 minutes of the end of class for your ending. Let's begin with a closer look at the closing assessment. The closing assessment is planned in order to bring closure to the lesson and to solidify student learning. But more importantly, the closing assessment is a type of formative assessment. This assessment guides the teacher in 3 ways. 1. To inform instruction and answer the question, what do I teach tomorrow? 2. To target review, what do I need to reteach? And 3. To differentiate instruction, which students need remediation and which need enrichment. Student mastery or non-mastery of the day's objectives will guide the next steps in your planning process. Without this assessment, you cannot answer these 3 questions. The same 3 to 5 rule of thumb is applied to the ending. So during this time, you will want to plan for 3 to 5 questions answered or 3 to 5 sentences written to determine if students mastered the objectives stated at the beginning of the lesson. Why is the closing assessment essential? Again, it helps provide feedback to the teacher and guides future instruction. It assesses the progress of the daily objectives, and it helps improve long-term retention by up to 50%. It provides an opportunity to reinforce key concepts or ideas and allows students to reflect on the day's lesson and to draw conclusions, which leads to higher order thinking. It also creates an opportunity for a smooth transition from one lesson to the next. Keep in mind that the closing assessment will look different in an elementary setting, a middle school setting, and a high school setting. We will look at examples from various grade levels shortly. During lesson planning, you will want to consider other questions as well. How do you determine your closing assessment questions in advance? Where do you want student learning to be at the close of your lesson? Your closing lesson will be based on the essential understanding or daily objectives. You may also need to consider what to do if your lesson does not progress as far as you had planned. And how is your closing assessment from one day related or linked to your focusing activity for the next day? This provides a continuous cycle of learning. Let's take a look at some examples. This is a first grade ELA lesson from the Core Knowledge Listening and Learning strand. Based on today's reading and discussion about the digestive system, students will respond to the 2 questions. The 2 questions will assess if students mastered the essential understanding from today's read aloud. Notice there are 2 questions which are not overly detailed or time-consuming. Both questions are text-based and require students to apply their knowledge of the digestive system. Here is an example from a 5th grade ELA lesson on Esperanza Rising. Students are asked to respond to a prompt with 3 to 5 sentences. Using specific details from the text, students are asked to compare and contrast the characters from the reading. Again, the closing assessment is not overly detailed or time-consuming. It is text-based, and the student's level of mastery can be determined based on the response to the prompt. Take a look at this 8th grade ELA example from LearnZillion. During this lesson, the students began reading The Ransom of Red Chief from the Telltale Heart unit. Based on today's reading, students are asked to refer to the text to answer the following questions. Take a minute to read the 3 questions. Notice that the questions increase in complexity, but are still not overly detailed. Students can reasonably be expected to answer within the 7 to 12 minute recommendation. Again, the questions are text-based, and the teacher will be able to determine mastery by the student's responses. The closing assessment is also used outside of ELA classes. Here is an example from a biology class. Students are asked to answer 3 questions pertaining to the relationship between cell growth and cell reproduction. Again, the questions increase in complexity and require the students to demonstrate their understanding of the day's objectives. This last example is from a high school history lesson where students have read and discussed poetry related to the nature of war during World War I. Students are asked to demonstrate their understanding of the nature of war by creating their own poem. So we see from all of these examples that the closing assessment is not overly time-consuming, but each provides an opportunity to collect rich learner feedback on what the students learned today and what to teach the following day. As stated earlier, because the ending of a lesson is oftentimes overlooked or rushed, it is important to identify a timekeeping strategy. This allows the teacher to focus on student learning and will make sure you build in time for the closing assessment. With any lesson, our goal is student mastery, and the closing assessment is one way to ensure that mastery is assessed. Here we see some examples of timekeeping strategies. You can use the timer on your phone, on your Promethean board, or use the online Google Timer feature. You may also want to designate a student to be your timekeeper and notify you when there are 7 to 12 minutes remaining in class. Now that we have covered the main 2 components of the lesson ending, let's review the importance of the instructional framework in regards to professional growth. Remember, it's all about coaching and improving our practice. The more coaching conversations we have, the more instruction will improve and student achievement will increase. As professionals, we want to continue to grow and get better at what we do. Our students deserve to attend schools where there is a culture of improvement for everyone. So how would feedback be determined if a walkthrough occurred during your closing assessment? On the top of the framework, or the how, the ending section would be looked at. Then the core actions, or the IPG indicators, would be looked at to determine the quality of the closing assessment. Let's go back to the 8th grade ELA assessment. These questions will help the teacher determine what to teach tomorrow, or if review, remediation, or enrichment is needed. Here we see 3 questions. but the 3 to 5 rule is just a suggestion. There is nothing wrong with 2 questions, or 6 questions, or 1 prompt as we saw in the example earlier. The guiding principle is what will give the teacher the feedback needed to determine where to go next with instruction. We would then move to the what section of the framework. We would first want to determine if the lesson, and more specifically here the ending, reflect the demands of the standard. In this case, the answer is yes. Next, we would take a look at Core Action 1. Did the lesson focus on a high-quality text? Remember, for classrooms outside of the ELA class, data representations, diagrams, graphs, or other representations of information may be appropriate. We would also want to consider, was the text at or above the quantitative and qualitative complexity level expected for the grade and time in the school year? Again, the answer is yes for both indicators. We would then look at Core Action 2 to determine if the questions or tasks were text-specific and accurately addressed the analytical thinking required by the standard. Did the questions return the student to the text? Did they require the student to collect and use evidence to demonstrate a true understanding of the day's objectives? Did the questions highlight the most important words or phrases, and were they sequenced to support building knowledge or a deeper understanding? Again, these questions from the lesson on the ransom of Red Chief meet all 4 indicators. Lastly, we will look at Core Action 3 to determine the level of student engagement. Does the closing assessment allow opportunities for productive struggle and perseverance? As students respond, does the teacher expect evidence and precision from the students? Here we are looking to move beyond general statements or answers and push for clear and specific evidence that proves student mastery and true understanding. When looking at Core Action 3, the answer will be dependent on the teacher actions in the room. Let's take another look at the ending. Remember, the ending is made up of the closing assessment and a timekeeping strategy. You will want to allow approximately 7 to 12 minutes at the end of class for your ending. The closing assessment is planned in order to bring closure to the lesson and to solidify student learning. The assessment guides the teacher in 3 ways. 1, to inform instruction and answer the question, what do I teach tomorrow? 2, to target review, what do I need to reteach? And 3, to differentiate which students need remediation and which students need enrichment. Remember the 3 to 5 rule, 3 to 5 questions answered, or 3 to 5 sentences written. However, you may choose to ask only 2 questions. You may have 6 questions. 3 to 5 is just a suggestion. You will also want to have a timekeeping strategy to ensure that you allow time for your ending. You have now seen a presentation on the lesson starter and the ending. Remember, both are essential in a highly effective lesson.